Is psychology finished? There is a very famous paper which we should all read and which scientists should read every day, called Why Most Published Research Findings Are False by Loannidis. And he's an expert on this topic. He's well recognized. Now, the idea is as follows. There is the assumption that medicine in general and psychology as the primary focus of this talk are constantly evolving and getting better and learning more things. And so this famous dean of the Harvard Medical School would give a lecture each year for the new incoming students, and he would start by saying that half of what they're going to learn will turn out to be false. And their job is to work out which half is right. This is nonsense. So he's wrong, because 99.93% of what we think is true is in fact true. And the reason is because it's all trivial. So you can't smoke a lion, or you can't dance the gavotte with a prime number, or there are unendlessly many trivial truths. Including the trivial truth that there is a distinction between truth and falsehood, for instance. So many philosophical truths are trivial truths, and we don't bother to record trivial truths precisely because they're trivial. Everyone knows them already. So most truths are boring. Now, what science is interested in is interesting truths. And truths may be interesting because they're about something in reality which is changing. And COVID is a good example. But the very fact that that something is reality is changing means that even if you find an interesting truth about that something, it's likely to be false in a few weeks or a few months because you're talking about a phenomenon which is changing. So that's an additional problem. Another problem is that there's no reward for discovering boring truths, and so everybody seeks interesting truths. A third problem is that boring truths are important. Ontology is all about boring truths, because if you don't have your boring truths well expressed and accepted by everybody using the same terminology, then you will never be able to build a framework which will enable you to discover interesting truths. All right, so why are most published research findings false? That's because scientists cheat. That's one of the reasons. We'll see why or how in a minute. So the false research findings generally are associated with small fields of research. For instance, research into healthy eating habits. When effect sizes are smaller, so really impressive effect sizes, they're going to be noticeable from a number of different dimensions. They're going to be well establishable. When there is a greater number and lesser pre-selection of tested relationships, I'll illustrate what that means in a minute. And most importantly, when they're likely to make you rich or well loved by your friends. So you're more likely to publish a false result, whether you know it's false or not is neither here nor there, if its publication will make your friends happy or will make you rich. And sadly, a published research finding is less likely to be true if it's interesting, because interesting truths are so hard to find. All the easy interesting truths have already been found. There are very few left. That's the rough idea. Finding interesting truths is really hard. All right, so there was something called the reproducibility crisis. It started already before 2010. Ioannidis' paper was in 2006. Many people started to notice, and many people started to think about reproducibility, particularly in psychology. Now, we know that there are lots and lots of statistically significant correlations everywhere. And so if you go looking for them, you'll probably find them. And if you're a psychologist, you might be tempted to publish them if they will make you rich or impress your friends. So this is a typical example. There is somewhere in Holland, I understand, a student union cafeteria, which is also a lab. They use it to test different arrangements of furniture and music and carpets and so forth in order to decide which is conducive to healthy eating. Now, I haven't actually seen any of the research coming out of this lab. I made up some research. So they have different colored tables, different shaped tables, different kinds of music, and either carpets or no carpets. So this is the experiment. For 4 weeks at a time, you use one or other of these arrangements. And then at the end of each 4 weeks, you do a summation of healthy food consumption. And then you choose the design of the cafeteria, which had the highest healthy food consumption, but more importantly, had a statistically significant correlation with healthy food consumption. And if you do enough of these experiments, you will find a high correlation between the design of the cafeteria and healthy food consumption. So you throw away all the other experiments and you publish the results. These are the results of your experiment. We discovered that using this particular table design and carpet design and so forth led to healthy eating, and it has a very, very good statistical significance measure. That's because one of these is bound to have a good statistical significance measure because of the laws of statistics. So green tables, that's what you want for healthy eating. So this is called p-hacking. Publication bias, or the file drawer problem, arises where you do lots of experiments until you find one which has a statistically significant result, and then you just publish that one. Throw away all the rest. Or you start manipulating your results so that you get statistically significant results by removing all the outliers. In other words, those cases which didn't fit your expected hypothesis. If they're outliers, obviously something went wrong, so we can ignore them. This is how one rationalizes removing the outliers, but that just means that you're amping up your statistical significance or amping down your p-values in order to get a publishable result. Now, there are many forms of scientific misconduct. P-hacking became recognized as a form of scientific misconduct in many circles, probably even in every psychology department and every decent psychology department in the world by now. They've realized that p-hacking is a bad thing. But still, it was going on in all the cases that I'll be talking about in a minute. Now, this is one of the more interesting cases. This is Amy Cuddy, who is a professor of something psychology in Harvard. Harvard Business School social psychologist who has a free no-tech life hack for anyone who is engaging in some kind of stressful event. So what you do is, well, you can see, and we've even got noise. Al Gore comes along. Oh, maybe you've seen Al Gore.
So this is. I'm going to start by offering you a free no-tech life hack. And all it requires of you is this, that you change your posture for 2 minutes. Powerful people tend to be, not surprisingly, more assertive and more confident, more optimistic. They actually feel that they're going to win even at games of chance. They also tend to be able to think more abstractly. So there are a lot of differences. We have this evidence, both that the body can shape the mind, at least at the facial level, and also that role changes can shape the mind. So what happens if you take a role change? What happens if you do that at a really minimal level, like this tiny manipulation, this tiny intervention? For 2 minutes you say, I want you to sound like this, and it's going to make you feel more powerful. So this is what we did. We decided to bring people into the lab and run a little experiment. And these people adopted for 2 minutes either high power poses or low power poses. They come in, they spit into a vial. We, for 2 minutes, say, you need to do this or this. They don't look at pictures of the poses. We don't want to prime them with the concept of power. We want them to be feeling power, right? So 2 minutes they do this. We then ask them, how powerful do you feel on a series of items? And then we give them an opportunity to gamble. And then we take another saliva sample. That's it. That's the whole experiment. So this is what we find. Risk tolerance, which is the gambling. What we find is that when you're in the high power pose condition, 86% of you will gamble. When you're in the low power pose condition, only 60%, and that's a pretty whopping significant difference. Here's what we find on testosterone. From their baseline when they come in, high power people experience about a 20% increase, and low power people experience about a 10% decrease. So again, 2 minutes and you get these changes.
So, she became famous. She was on Colbert and Guardian and so forth. 20 online talks that could change your life. But very soon, problems started to arise. So one of her co-authors discovered that there are problems with the experiments, and she came to the conclusion that the effects are not real. And other people then tried to replicate the experiments, and they too discovered that they're not real. So this is just one example of the crisis of confidence in social psychology. And there are many, many others. So there were a whole series of reproducibility studies which were carried out. For instance, examining the effects of birth order on personality. There are no effects of birth order on personality. And then one which was just examined this year, poverty does not impede cognitive functioning. That was a very well-established psychological result, which of course makes a lot of people happy, but it doesn't replicate. All right, now there have been 5 proposed solutions. The first of these is reproducibility projects, which I'll talk about. The remainder, well, we'll see. So, the first reproducibility project was in psychology, and it sought to replicate 100 studies from major publications. And they worked with the original investigators to make sure that they got all the experimental conditions right and so forth. And this is a discussion. It's incredibly complicated to do a reproducibility study. And it's now clear, I think, that reproducibility science is itself not reproducible, which is a problem. So the results were set forth, including all the statistical measures and safeguards and so forth. Really very, very complicated work. And of the 100 studies that they examined, only 36 replicated. But even they did not replicate to the full extent of the original claims. So the effects were smaller than in the initial study. So more examples. Currency priming. If you merely expose participants to money, then this increases their endorsement of the social system. And imagining contact with members of ethnic outgroups reduces prejudice. Another one, which is one I really like, just holding a pen between your teeth makes you happier. This is the Far Side Comics experiment. So psychology is such a problem because every set of individuals is different. And we know how much variance there is across the people, just the people that we know. If you imagine all the people who might potentially be subjects in psychological experiments, you can see that there's very low likelihood that you're going to get the same responses to the same kinds of weird experiments that psychologists like to perform. So that itself causes a problem for replication. But it also causes a problem for the status of the claims which are being made by the psychologists. So medicine too has a problem. I'll come back to that later on if there's time. This study, which was done in 2015, established that a large amount of money is being spent on medical research which is not reproducible. So there was a reproducibility project on cancer biology. Someone I know very well had his paper subjected to the reproducibility test, and they put him on the threshold between reproducible and not reproducible. He became really angry because he's sure that his methods are reproducible. And this is just more evidence, I believe, that reproducibility science is itself not reproducible. Now, maybe X-phi is reproducible. And I don't know if there are any co-authors of this paper in the room. But this was a very optimistic paper saying that even though all these bad psychologists don't do reproducible work often, we, philosopher psychologists, we are much better than that, and we do reproducible work. Now, there is somebody called Syed Sayamondost, who published a series of papers showing that X-phi papers are often not reproducible. And the X-phi people created a website. It's a very interesting website by Nobi, where they list all the replication work done on all the X-phi publications up to a certain date. So 47 experiments. 22 of them replicated according to their own experiments. 25 of them did not replicate, which is not good news. The next one is stop publishing, because remember, it's only published research findings that are mostly false. And I take this one seriously. Journals create bad incentives. Journals want to make money. They want to publish interesting results. They don't really care about truth or falsity. They probably care a little bit more since people have started to think about reproducibility. But in general, they want to make money. Also, people who publish want to publish, but without revealing all the secret source that made their experiments work, because otherwise other people could use the same secret source and get the Nobel Prize before then. And so, even though everyone has an incentive to publish, everyone also has an incentive to hold some of the things back, particularly the data. And so, people like Atul Butte, he wants to replace journal publication with brilliant hacking, done by people like him. He is a brilliant hacker. The idea is that journals slow down the process of disseminating data. So you shouldn't need to go through this strange bottleneck. You should just throw your data out there in the world and let people like Atul work out what it all means. And a possible compromise is that you still continue publishing, but you at the same time you make all your data available freely from the start. This would change the way science, particularly medical science, is currently practiced. But it won't happen because of the reasons that I described: publication incentives and Nobel Prize incentives. And I just mentioned that in order for brilliant hacking to work, that this is Atul Butte down here, you need ontologies, because unless people code their data in the same ways every time, you will not be able to understand their meaning, the meaning of those data, unless you're an insider. So ontologies make it possible for outsiders to exploit data. And this is a piece explaining the role of ontologies in the specific kinds of data that Atul Butte is responsible for publishing. All right. Another idea was requiring pre-registration of all experiments. So there was $1 million pre-registration challenge. If you pre-register, that means you pre-register that you're going to test whether green square tables with jazz music and no carpets will lead to healthier eating. No one is going to pre-register such an experiment. They may pre-register 64 different experiments simultaneously, but that would raise red flags. It seems that registration died apart from clinical trials, which were being registered anyway. You have to register clinical trials. Now, why did registration not work? Why did it not catch on? Well, first of all, again, the Nobel Prize problem. People didn't want other people to know what they were working on. You could keep the registration details private, I guess, but at some point they have to be unveiled, and then you have to compare whether the experiment was actually performed in accordance with the pre-registered hypothesis and the pre-registered methods and so forth. People don't like to do that. They like to do a bit of tweaking along the way, trial and error, when they set up their equipment and so forth, and when they work out which statistics they're going to apply. If you have to specify all of those things in advance, then you've tied all three of your hands behind your back before you even start doing any research. Moreover, there is an ontology problem here again. People use different terms. The antibodies are used very often in medical experiments. Just one antibody may have 35 different names in different disciplines. And people don't like necessarily to use the same names. They like to have their own local disciplinary ways of describing things. All right, so registration did not really work apart from clinical trials. And to work out how all of these things, materials, hypotheses, methods, and so on, are to be described is already a quite significant ontological problem. We have some of the ontological solutions to that problem, but communicating those solutions to all researchers who might want to register an experiment is practically impossible, particularly if they don't want to listen. All right, the next solution would be to redefine statistical significance. This is what Ioannidis recommends. So instead of a p-value of 0.05, we make p-hacking very hard by insisting on a p-value of 0.005. The only way to do this is to increase sample sizes. You need to have millions of subjects, which is very hard in psychology. Psychology departments are usually very big. So I think the psychology department is the biggest department in the College of Arts and Sciences here. But they're undergraduates. That's not a big problem. You can do some of these experiments with undergraduates, but you can't get millions and millions of undergraduates who will all perform the same experiment under the same conditions. You can only do that if the result is going to have a payoff. So you can do it for an autism experiment or for a cancer experiment. But you can't do it for an experiment about whether holding a pencil in your teeth makes you happy. So big data, sharing of data, consortium-based science is what is needed to make the new p-value limit work. And we have some really good experiments at these levels. 2.7 million samples genotyped. The problem is that when we do these big experiments on autism or on intelligence and so forth, we discover the effect sizes are quite low. So people were looking for the gene for intelligence, and they're getting closer and closer to an understanding of the genetic basis of intelligence. They're now, I think, up to 2 million subjects. But what they're discovering is that there is no gene for intelligence. There are hundreds and thousands of SNP, SNPs, all of which play some role in some people at some time, maybe. And so there is no big payoff. It's small effects, even at the cost of very large consortium experimentation. All right. So none of these things are working. So journals don't work. The journals are still all powerful. They don't like to publish replications, so nobody does replication experiments anymore. And they don't like to publish negative results. Negative results such as that this paper didn't replicate. So we don't need to keep putting pencils between our teeth. And then science and nature have become a combination of science and politics. There are political reasons why certain papers are accepted for journals like Nature, it seems, which is conducive to non-replication for the reasons given by Ioannidis. All right, so data sharing, the idea that you would create better experiments with larger subjects and therefore lower p-values by sharing data across many consortium members, doesn't work because although the NIH has data sharing policies for the people it funds, these data sharing policies have no teeth. And so people don't quite ignore them, but they don't take them really seriously. And then the same Nobel Prize research incentives remain. Everybody wants to have an exciting result for obvious reasons. Now, the really bad side of all of this is that even where it is known that a study did not replicate, people still cite that study as evidence for their own work to the same degree that they cite those studies which are still clean, as it were. And that's today. And if there is time, I'll give you a really sad example in a minute. Okay, so for psychology, the hypothesis presents itself that perhaps all the interesting, experimentally verifiable results that might ever be achieved have already been achieved. Only small effects remain, and those small effects can never be tested in a reproducible way, because they're so small that any two subject pools will manifest them with an equal likelihood as not manifesting them. Studies in psychology have a low power, so the average power was 36%. I believe that the standard is 80%. And power means that you didn't have enough samples in order to have a statistically significant result. Again, that's today, 2018. There's high inter-study variance, again, during as a result of the fact that every subject sample set is different. And the conclusion of this paper is that the low power and high heterogeneity of samples fully explain recent difficulties to replicate highly regarded psychological studies and reveal challenges for scientific progress in psychology. So, there are probably no truths left to be discovered, ladies and gentlemen, in psychology. So it seems. What consequences does this have for psychology itself? Well, it's a slow process. But these are the statistics for people going into health service psychology subfields. And these are the statistics going into research subfields. The percent change is 28% here, 22% here. That's associated with 2 degrees, the PhD degree, which is still has the more cachet among psychologists, and the PsyD degree, which is a model on the MD degree. You get the PsyD degree in order to go into the healthcare business, or into human resources, or advertising, or some other area where you can apply the psychological results that you've learned, where PhDs are given for original research. Now, as I've mentioned, there are problems in other disciplines, and I'll just mention the corrupted cell line problem. So there is a famous supposed breast cancer cell line, which was in fact a misidentified skin cancer line. Now, there are 900 studies on this supposed breast cancer cell line, which presuppose that it is a breast cancer cell line, which have been published in peer-reviewed publications. And this is a scandal. Nearly 250 of these studies were published even after the mistaken cell line was conclusively identified. But researchers are still using the skin cancer cell line in breast cancer studies published in 2021. All of those studies remain in the literature. And the studies which do not replicate are still being cited equally as often as those which do, in cancer as much as in psychology. So I'm not suggesting that we should stop working on medical research, but it seems to be a problem. I will finish with a joke posting by an autism specialist in 2018, drawing attention to the crisis in autism studies. So this is what happens typically when he reads a new press release on a new autism study. It's much longer than this. This is just the top fraction. So he goes through and checks off all the things that he anticipates. Yet another study on autism will manifest. So that's it. That's the end.